Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started in just a few moments. Great to see people coming in from the waiting room. Very excited to have you here.
Hello, everybody from sunny California.
Great to see so many people coming in. All right. Well, we're going to continue letting people in from the waiting room, but we are going to get started. It is 12:01 here in California, but we know that we are attracting an international crowd. So for some of you, it is evening. Hopefully it's not the middle of the night for anybody watching, but if that is your case, mad props to you for showing up in the middle of the night. Hello, everyone. I'm Julie Lythcott Haims, and I have the great pleasure and honor of getting to be in conversation with Terri Givens around her terrific new book that is officially launching today, Radical Empathy. Radical Empathy is published by Bristol University Press in England, and we're delighted to have their support in putting on today's conversation. So the book is coming out today. It is out today, and we're officially kicking off Terri's book launch with this conversation. Want to let you know that there's an opportunity to purchase the book. You're going to see that link in the chat, and there's actually a discount code, Empathy50. So when you order that book today, right now, which you should do, make sure you put in that code Empathy50 and get your 50% discount off this terrific book. Enough about the logistics and the buying of the book for the moment. Let me now introduce our guest. Terri Givens is a political scientist and the CEO and founder of Brighter Higher Ed. She started her academic career as a first-generation undergraduate at Stanford University here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and went on to get her PhD at UCLA in Southern California. She has taught at the University of Washington, at the University of Texas at Austin, where she was also vice provost for undergraduate curriculum. And most recently, she was the provost at Menlo College here in the Silicon Valley area. Terri is the author of many, many books and articles on the radical right, on immigration policy, and on the politics of race in Europe. She has a strong commitment to her community and is currently on several nonprofit boards, including Foundation for a College Education, which is located here in East Palo Alto, California. And that's how Terri and I really know each other well. We actually met in college many, many decades ago, but we've come to know one another as professional women, as thinkers, as authors through our work for Foundation for a College Education. Terri is now the board chair there. I used to be the board chair. And so we have been deeply knowing one another over the last few years. So Terri, I'm honored that you asked me to be a part of your book tour. Delighted to be here. What's not in your bio is that you are an African-American woman. That's and right. Married to a white man, and the mother of two amazing sons who are Black, who are biracial, who are multiracial. I don't presume to know how they identify. And so you have both a keen, precise knowing about race, about difference, about the harm that we cause one another on the basis of our differences. You know that through an academic lens. You've chosen your field within political science to be a focus on the politics of race and immigration policy and the radical right in Europe. And yet here we are in the San Francisco Bay Area, California, United States, where you have lived much of your adult life. And you've chosen this time around, after writing a slew of books from the lens of a political scientist, from the lens of an academic, you've decided to go personal. And that's where I want to begin. I want to ask you, I mean, let's go broader than that even. Let's assume that the 130 people on this call are not already deeply familiar with who you are. Why don't you give us a brief bio sketch on who you are? And then I want you to land with why, after all of this academic work, and not to say this isn't an academic work, but this is very much written, it is very much a memoir written for a lay audience, designed to be very accessible outside of academia as well as within. Tell us why you ultimately decided, you know what, I need to insert my personal story and my personal feelings into this discourse around race.
That's right. And, my story starts in Spokane, Washington in 1964. My parents were living in Spokane, and that's mostly where I grew up. My dad was in the military, and we were stationed for a couple of years in upstate Michigan. But the important thing to understand about Spokane is that it is, very much a white city. And when I was born, Blacks were were less than 1% of the population. And so, I grew up there. I mean, I have to say I had a fairly normal childhood and so on. But as I grew up, and got older and started to learn more about my family and so on, I started to have a lot of questions. Why did my parents, who had met in Los Angeles, my mother was from Louisiana, my father was from Pittsburgh, why did they decide to stay in Spokane? And, I call my 20s in particular my years of cognitive dissonance, because I had this sense that, and I talk a lot about growing up in Spokane in the book, but, the main thing that I got out of that is my parents really tried to have us be assimilated into white culture and white society. And, that's not to say I didn't grow up with Black culture. I certainly did. But it was really interesting to dig into what were some of the things. I'm a researcher, right? So when I have a question, I want to do more research on it. So I looked into a lot of these issues about respectability politics and so on. And, it really led me to thinking about, my family's role in the broader scheme of what was going on in the country at the time. So, if you think about the late 1960s, my parents probably decided to stay in Spokane because going back to Los Angeles wasn't a great option for their kids. There's the watch riots, all kinds of things going on. And also, I have to admit, I had some anger about the fact that, we grew up in this place where we didn't have a lot of connection to family and so on, but they were doing their best to try and, give us an opportunity to be successful, right? And that's what it comes down to, with good schools and the opportunities that happen when you can be comfortable in white society. And so as I got into academia and so on, and started studying the politics of race, I realized that, not just that, but just being in academia made me realize how far we had not come in, basically improving the situation. I experienced racism and sexism, in all different ways, even though I was very successful. And, I just remember there was one moment I think of in particular is that I was driving. I just remember this moment so clearly because I was driving through Berkeley. I had been at a meeting and I heard a story on NPR talking about how Black women were more likely to die in childbirth and that fetal mortality was high. And it didn't matter what socioeconomic class you were in. And it kind of clicked with me. Oh my gosh, I've always been so grateful that, I've had all this success. I went to Stanford, I went to UCLA, I've had great jobs. And yet I could still, like Serena Williams,
Right.
die because I'm a Black woman. And that just really hit home for me. Also, the fact that we aren't just doing enough to increase. I mean, the percentage of Black faculty has not increased. The women in faculty is very slowly increasing, particularly in my field of political science. And I realized I could bring my research to bear on these issues that we were seeing on a day-to-day basis. And I started doing this book long before last summer when we had all the protests, obviously.
Yeah.
But, I really felt that I had the opportunity to bring together my personal story and help people gain empathy by understanding my story, but also connecting it to the broader issues we see in society today.
I think they don't have empathy for us because they don't see us as human.
That's right.
They don't see us as being within the same, and I say us, I'm this light-skinned biracial Black woman, very much identify as Black, have had similar experiences to you in similar spaces, and have written about it myself in memoir form. And my sense is that they don't see the Black child dead on the street as problematic at the hands of a police officer because they don't see that Black child as human.
Mhm.
They don't see the plight of Serena Williams and everybody else trying to access medical care while giving birth as problematic, because they don't really see us as equally human. That's my theory. That
Mhm.
is to say, when you see somebody as equally human to yourself, then their pain is your pain. Their concerns matter to you. Their needs are legitimate. But if you see somebody as other in a
Mhm.
different category, them, then you're like, well, whatever circumstance they're in, that's their fault. That's their problem. It's not my problem. Um, I wonder what you think about that. I wonder what
I
you,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think that's so true. And but the interesting thing to me, what I would add to that is they see us, people like us who are successful. We've read books, we've been at Stanford, all of that. They see us as the exception,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
So, we're the exceptional ones who happen to make it. We aren't the norm. And what drives me crazy is the reality. I just saw this article that talked about. Actually, I was listening to a podcast that was saying there's a neuro whatever researcher at Stanford. I don't know the exact title, but she was talking about the fact we all have the capacity to learn, right?
Yeah.
There's she actually, the woman who started the idea around growth mindset is backing off of that, because everybody has growth mindset.
Mm.
Everybody can learn, and yet we treat people from certain groups as being deficient. And
Yeah.
so I'd take us a step back, Julie, and say the reason they don't see us as human is because of structural racism,
Yeah.
right? Because we all live in the sea of white supremacy. So white is the norm. We are not the norm. um, that's why I say, we're seen as we're successful, but we're the exception. And
Yeah.
so the problem is, I always tell people, when I talk about, radical empathy, the first thing people will say, well, what can I do? Well, let's start with your neighborhood.
Yeah.
Where do you live? I
Yeah.
happen to live in Menlo Park, which is, and you live in Palo Alto. We both live in a very, very expensive place. But when we look around, we're the only people of color in our neighborhood. And, we have to understand why that is. And so that's why I really focus in on you as an individual need to understand how you have been impacted, and I have understand how I have been impacted by structural racism. I live
Yeah.
in the sea of white supremacy too. And so to me, the
Yeah.
norm has been,
Yeah.
white.
So I want to get in a second to your definition of radical empathy, and I want you to tell us what it is, and I want you to tell us how it's different from empathy, because I think we throw
Mhm.
a lot of words around that are synonyms, and it'd be good to know, since the title of this wonderful book is Radical Empathy, we need to know what that is. But hold that for a second. To this notion of we are exceptions, those of us who are highly educated have been given opportunity, are privileged in various ways. Um, the things we deal with are not what people think of as violence or harm or something anyone should care about. They're very subtle manifestations of white supremacy.
Mhm.
So, for me, an example that comes to mind that was actually so painful for me and so close to home at Stanford, I didn't put it in my memoir because I was worried it's too soon. Like, I can't actually speak this truth out loud, but now I'm gonna.
Mhm.
I'm in day 3 as a member of the president's senior staff, and I'm loving this job. It's a culmination of everything I've done to date. The president is being installed as our new president. Pomp and circumstance is only available in academia. The robes, the velvet, the music. We're gathering the entourage to go to the installation, and the dignitaries are arriving. And this white female dignitary walks into the president's building, hands me her coat without even making eye contact, and continues walking as if I am the help.
Mhm.
And there's nothing wrong with being the help, right? I mean, plenty of our people are the help. And I wasn't the help. I was a senior member of that team. And I had felt so proud of myself. I'm in day 3 on the job, and I was knocked at my knees. And I kind
Mhm.
of looked around helplessly at my colleagues, hoping someone else would have noticed, hoping someone else would say, damn, that was what an assumption she made. and nobody said a word. And later, as I tried to appeal to, somebody like, can you believe that happened? They're like, oh, don't take it personally. That could have happened to any of us, said my white male colleague. And I thought, oh my God,
No,
that is not true. And that's a very subtle example of, I think, one of many stories that, you can tell. And I just want people on the call who haven't lived this experience, who haven't walked this path, to appreciate the subtlety and the sort of ways in which it sort of looks normal and fine, but it's actually stabbing us in the heart.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah. So go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, this happens all the time. And, it's interesting because you're talking about this in an academic context, right?
Yeah.
And believe me, in academia, so basically, people don't understand, a lot of times that when I'm in these spaces, because I'm in those rarefied spaces as well, hanging out in the president's office, I was the provost,
Right.
I have to assume that when I'm with, and it's not just necessarily even white people, but people are going to assume I am not the boss, so I have my armor on, right? And I walk into a room and, people will tell me I have a presence and I have to have that presence because I have to walk in the room and I have to immediately help people understand that, I'm the person leading this meeting. I am the provost, I am the vice provost, because I have to assume people are going to make an assumption that I am not, that I am something less than. It's somebody put in the chat, this unconscious demotion.
Yeah. So Suzanne Wertheim is saying, this is something I research and write about, have named unconscious demotion. And there's a lot of people saying, yes, unconscious demotion. So let's recenter radical empathy. Why did you come up with that term? What does it mean? How is it different from these other terms that are ostensibly similar?
Well, I have to give a shout out to my Star Trek fans out there because there's a famous Star Trek episode called The Empath, which was one of my favorite episodes. But, when I saw that, it really struck home to me because I've always felt that I was very empathetic, and to the point where sometimes I feel other people's pain. And so to me, empathy was always very much a fixture in my life. And I talk about the fact that I feel like some of the reason I have so much empathy is because of my mother. My mother had mental illness and could be very, she would yell a lot. I mean, there's a lot going on there, but it made me want to be more open and understanding of people. I wanted to, I kind of wanted to be the opposite of my mother in that sense. And so I started thinking about empathy and how important it was for me to understand other people and to really start having, I realized I had to have empathy for myself to really be able to do that deep dive inside, to really get at what the things were that were bothering me about the way I was raised, about how I felt, sectioned off from a lot of Black society and even family members, right? And so I had to put myself out there and make so we can kind of jump into the 6 steps, because the first step is willingness to be vulnerable, right? And I had to be vulnerable and use empathy to understand myself first. And then I really felt that once I had that in place, I thought, well, empathy doesn't, tons of people have empathy, it's not, you have to practice it, but it's something that, I know a lot of people have, but they can try to at least try to put themselves in our shoes. But then what next? So I came up with radical empathy because I was like, we have to take action and create change, right? Because radical empathy means that you are, you have the empathy, you're stepping into somebody's shoes, but you also have to reach out to people. And, I've been working with some different organizations. And one thing I have to remind our white allies is that you have to listen. Because listening is really critical when you're trying to practice empathy and have empathy, but also give people a comfortable space to do that, right? Because I hear stories all the time, and I do a lot of mentoring and talking to people, especially in academia. And one of the things I've noticed is that even for our allies, they want to be paternalistic. They want to step in, and I've had this experience where, I've had my white male mentors. They've been wonderful. And believe me, I talk about my white male mentors, but sometimes they're a little too paternalistic. And it's like, dudes, I have to make my own decisions here, and I think I have enough capacity here to manage my life. And so I see a lot of paternalism out there for those of us who have, and I don't know if you've experienced that, Julie, but I find, it's almost like, they feel they have to be protective of us.
Yeah, absolutely. So how to be a good ally without overreaching and overstepping and being paternalistic, super important. Okay, so it sounds like empathy is caring, having feelings about people who are not you, and maybe even stepping in their shoes. But radical empathy is action. It is stepping outside, not just in their shoes, but then walking in those shoes and doing something about it. There seems to be a velocity to radical empathy that activates it. Okay, is that right?
Yep,
okay.
absolutely.
I want to list the 6 steps. So for those of you who are going to get the book, I don't know how many people actually have the book in hand yet. We now have 153 people on this call, which is amazing. Where the 6 steps are summarized on page 21 if you happen to have the book. But go ahead, Terri, for those who don't have it. And actually, Terrence has put them in the chat, which is awesome. So why don't you talk us through the 6 steps?
Yeah. So the first is willingness to be vulnerable. And that was one of the, even before I started writing the book, I had to, I realized that's probably one of the most important steps, because one of the problems is that people have a tendency to just want to take action first. Yeah. Right. And I run into that every time I do a workshop. They're like, just tell us what to do. It's like, no, you have to start with yourself, and you have to be vulnerable and understand that you are part of the problem and part of the solution. So you need to understand yourself first. And once you understand, once you get vulnerable, then you can become grounded in who you are. And this is the process I had to go through myself as I was kind of preparing to write this book. So then the third step is opening yourself to the experiences of others. And that was something I, had to do in the sense of even trying to understand my parents. I spent a lot of time working on a genealogy, and there's so many stories out of that. But, that for me, it was, I remember I kind of had a breakthrough one evening where I was writing a blog post, and I said, I know my grandfather on my mom's side was a sharecropper. My mother was a seamstress, and I'm a, professor with a PhD.
Yeah.
And then when I read Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns, I was like, oh my God, my mom and my grandfather, I am their dream. So that really helped me to get a better handle on understanding even, their experiences, so that I could then practice empathy. So step 4 is practicing empathy, and we have to do that all the time. I have to do it all the time. Trying to I was just listening to a story on KQD about the attacks on Asian Americans here in the U.S. Which has been horrible. It's been happening a lot here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I said, that's an area where we all need to have it. Practice empathy. What is it? What are these people going through? And I was thinking at that time, this is my time to practice empathy for these people who are experiencing these horrible crimes. But then, the next step is taking action. So what action can I take now that I know that, and try to understand the situation? And at the end of every chapter, there is a set of actions that you can take. So that's why, when I was writing the book, I realized, I can't just lay this out. I need to give people concrete actions that they can take. And just so people know, we've also created a reading guide that pulls together the different activities and actions you can do. But I will remind people, it's partly starting with yourself and then moving onward. So there's taking action, but then the real thing is that we have to create change. And that's why the last chapter of the book focuses on transitional justice and how we can create change more broadly in our country. Because if there's nothing else I want to do, is to really create change for our country, and so we can start to move forward and get past. You can't get past it. We have to live, but that we really live with the history and understand it, and start thinking ways we can improve and get past it, bridge racial divides. That's
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So we'll get to that sort of broader systemic, national, international, global stuff that can happen. But before we go all the way out there, I want to keep it really here, which is this really deeply personal, vulnerable piece. I really love this part of the list because this is where my work lays. As a memoirist, I try to just connect story to story, like listen, I listen to your story, you listen to mine. We develop, a sense of I'm not alone, in this. Other people feel these things. I'm seen, I'm heard. I can share. When I share and I'm vulnerable, I can connect beautifully with other people. I want to say in this context that we are not, of course, presuming that the 150 plus people on this call are all any particular race or ethnicity. I'm assuming it's a very diverse crowd, and you've spoken quite vulnerably, I think, about the fact that you, as a Black person growing up in Spokane with parents whose goal was you will assimilate because they believed that was the easiest, the way forward, not the easiest, but the necessary path. This we can internalize the oppression.
Yes.
We can internalize the stereotypes. The term is internalized oppression, right? So having love and empathy for ourselves first as Black folk or brown folk or queer folk or poor folk or whomever we are in our identity that is marginalized or viewed as less than by others. Can you speak directly to that? That is, do I have empathy for myself? Do I actually have empathy for my people? What's your relationship with that? What's your experience with that? And how have you kind of, overcome it?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, my 20s were my years of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
And I realized where that dissonance was coming from is I am a Black person, and yet I wasn't raised around other Black people. And, and yet people try to put me in boxes, some people want to put me in the box, well, you're well spoken and educated, so you're this kind of Black person. Or, people who didn't know me would try to put me in a box and say, well, because you're Black, you have to be this way, and so I really didn't know who I was. I had a really hard time figuring out who I could be. And I finally just said, just be yourself, and that's, I very clearly remember that it was around the time actually I started dating my husband. And I really had to just sit myself, actually therapy, very big fan of therapy. And so years of therapy, and I, sometimes I go back and check in, but a lot of it had to do with, so the dissonance there was that my parents clearly thought we shouldn't be around other Black people. That means Black people, to me, the simplistic thing is Black people are bad. But if Black people are bad, then I'm bad.
Right.
So, I had to get past that and understand. And, I didn't think Black people were bad, and frankly, but I had to go out of my comfort zone and say, I have to be the one to reach out there in that situation. And I did. I started reaching out to family members. I've been to Opelousas, Louisiana, where my mother was born. I did it actually kind of in preparation for this book. I did a tour of the South, Alabama, Georgia, and just very quickly tell the story. I talk about it in the book, but I remember my friend Oots McKnight took me to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is basically the lynching memorial. And, I just wanted to go because I remember when it opened in April of, I think it was 2019, I knew I had to go visit. And it may have been 2018, but regardless, I knew when I had to go visit it for some reason. And so I arranged with my friend Utz McKnight to go give a talk at University of Alabama and go visit it. And I was walking through and I suddenly had this premonition, wait a second, what if I see the name of somebody who's related to me? And so I looked up Opelousas, and it sits by county, all the different pillars in there. And look it up if you haven't seen it. It's incredibly impressive. And if you go there, it's just, But in any case, I got to the St. Landry Parish, which is where Opelousas is, and I see the name Julie and Stelly, and my heart just stopped. I mean, I couldn't breathe. Julie and Stelly is my mother's maiden name. And actually, smartphone, I could quickly look up his story, which, he was lived outside of Opelousas, was trying to register people to vote. It was 1898, Ku Klux Klansmen come, a group of them, and they get into a gun battle, and he was shot and killed. And, it made me realize, this history is not ancient history. It's something that we are still living with. And that's why I get so upset. And I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but that's why I get so upset. And that's why, January 6th was so upsetting. That's why we get so upset when we see voter suppression, because that's what has been happening to us. A lot of the violence and the killing revolves around, trying to keep us from voting.
Yeah.
And my relatives were impacted by that. Yeah. So in any case, that was just so, life changing, really.
So learning your history, learning your family history, your connection to the broader Black experience, the Great Migration, what was happening in the South, sounds like it was nourishing for you and healing.
Absolutely.
You also gave a shout out to therapy. I'll give a shout out to therapy. You said you never felt Black people were bad. I will admit that I did. I mean, I was that Black kid who grew up in white spaces, being afraid of Black people, being ashamed that I was Black, and trying to be what white people valued. And when I came to terms with all of that in my 30s through tears and of shame, I thought I was the only Black person who ever felt that way. It was like all of a sudden that racist clamp that was on my sense of self was released. It was like a bully had been chasing me, and I finally stood around and named it and called it what it was, and it went away. So to any Black folk, brown folk watching, listening, who have been in that place and have not yet done the work, do the work. Terri and I have both come from different places, have done this work, and it is liberating. And now we can be rooted in our liberation and celebration of Black excellence and joy without this sort of other piece of where those stereotypes linger in our own spirit. Let's go to two more questions before we open it up to the audience questions. You've talked about allyship, but I think people would love some specifics on, okay, what do I do if I'm not in the group, if I'm not the Black or brown person, but I want to be of use? You've talked about how mentors and well-meaning people can be overly paternalistic. So give some concrete examples of what allyship looks like in this moment in our neighborhoods. If you just pick some examples, neighborhoods, schools, workplaces, and then we're going to go to the national transitional justice, the recommendations you have about how we can really change the world. And then we'll go to people's questions.
Right. So there's a lot of things you can do, but the first, so once you get past the step of understanding, hopefully, the first thing you do is try to understand structural racism and internalize it. So get that out of the way. But some of the first steps you can take, like I said, are very local. Try it and go and one of the things, I wouldn't have done it if I had known more about the pandemic, but we went to Lunar New Year last year. Because I'd never been. And, that was a great experience for me. It really opened me up to what was going on in the Chinese and Asian community in San Francisco. And so what I've tried to do is go out of my comfort zone, go to community events, go to, find out what's going on in those communities. That's, a first step, and then figure out what you want to support. So for example, you and I have supported Foundation for a College Education. I'm into sports, so I support Fit Kids. I support our local NPR station because they do a lot of good work. But, find those organizations that you can support. And then it's important then to go beyond that. And what we really need is change in our political system, right? And we saw that, we know this is a very deep and difficult issue. And so, we all need to, push our our elected officials, write letters, send postcards. And so there's a lot that can be done to support issues that are really important. Like right now, the $15 minimum wage is something that deeply impacts communities of color.
Right.
And that's, I've been sending messages but so anyway, there's lots of different things you can do, but the trick is imagine, look what happened in the last election. People like Stacey Abrams were out there mobilizing people. That's the kind of thing. We need people to vote. We need people to get out there, get other people to vote. But I think one other last thing I'll mention is stand up when you hear people saying things that are racist or sexist. Step up and say something.
Yeah, it takes bravery. It takes
Mhm.
bravery and guts to be an ally, but this moment requires that. And frankly, the American moment, not just now, but going back through time, has required it. So let's speak to that American moment. Here we are, 2021. We had the rise of a politician who was supported by the radical right, by the white nationalists, by white supremacists. A lot of people didn't see it coming, but a lot of us did. And
Mhm.
particularly someone like you who's been studying these movements for years elsewhere, here you are in the United States watching similar stuff happen here. You've got probably a better perspective than anybody on what we ought to be doing. I know in the book you talk about South Africa, you talk about Germany, you talk about these other places that have achieved or attempted to achieve this transitional justice. And you have a clear sense of what has worked and what hasn't. And, if you had the ear of President Biden and the new attorney general who should be Merrick Garland and, head of Homeland Security, that has labeled white supremacists as domestic terrorists and the FBI, like if you had their ear, what would you tell them that we need to do in this? And obviously it's not just the government. There have to be non-governmental solutions, local solutions, et cetera. But what would you tell folks? What is our way forward here?
So I'm a big fan of truth and reconciliation, and I know it hasn't always worked exactly as folks would hope. But I talk about this idea of truth and reconciliation because of my experiences in Germany and South Africa, where they've had to deal with horrific histories, right? And especially after January 6th, I think I really believe in the importance of getting the truth out, and part of that has to do with the fact that we need to understand the broader context, like why were people so upset about it, and what actually did happen and who were the people behind it. And that's why I'm glad to see that the FBI is out there going after the perpetrators. And every day we hear of new arrests and so on, but we need the truth to come out. And it can't necessarily, sometimes in the courts of law it doesn't come out, right? Because you've got the various ways that works. I think so. If I were advising Joe Biden right now, I would say we need to develop a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that allows people to come and talk about what happened. And even the perpetrators, because you're seeing people recant now. They get into jail and they're like, oh, I didn't realize, I didn't understand, I thought that I was being told to do this. That may not be the truth, but maybe it is. And it's important that those things, that we develop a record of what happened. And I really believe a Truth and Reconciliation Commission could do that in a way. And I know there's going to be commissions and so on. And frankly, as a political scientist, I've studied, especially around immigration policy, the commissions that have come out over the years. And I really do think that, some of the commissions that have gone around the various commissions that focused on immigration policy, or even 9/11, have done good work, and we need to have that work going now. But it really needs to stretch back to and look at the history, how we ended up where we are, and to have people come and testify about their experiences and so on. So
Frankly, I'm afraid the moment has passed. And so I'm delighted to hear you say that you think it's still possible and, of course, imperative, by which I mean, it feels as if we have entered a new era. It feels as if we have entered an Israel-Palestine stance with one another, as those of us who believe in social justice and racial equity on the one hand, face off against those who are like, this is a white country, it has always been and should always be a white country, and to hell with the rest of you. And I'm concerned that the opportunity, the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s era dialogue of sort of reconciliation, it was a time in which truth and reconciliation might have been possible. We didn't achieve it, but I do worry that now we seem to have sort of jumped into a place of tremendous impatience on the part of people who feel like, you Black and brown people, you've taken our this, you've taken our that, you don't deserve this, you don't deserve that. It's all so where does your optimism come from?
Yeah, and I think this addresses Jamie's question about the 75 million Americans who believe complete fabrications. Is that so actually I think this is an opportunity, because we saw the reason I believe there's an opportunity is because I saw what happened last summer, in terms of people, really jumping into this discussion when they saw the death of George Floyd and going out and marching. I mean, even here in Little Menlo Park, my Menlo Park neighborhood, we had a march for Black Lives. And so actually, I think the moment is opportune, because more people who are of good faith basically are, reading the books and coming to things like this, and more, I think people are more willing to talk about it than ever. And so I think the value is that, the only way you're going to, get those 75 million people to hear something is we just have to pound away at it. That's what Trump and his cronies did. They just kept pounding away at the falsehoods, and, and we have to do the same with the truth. We have to be hitting people up every day. It just has to be something we repeat over, story after story after story. And, so I have friends who did research on why, same-sex marriage became, popular. And it's because people realized, I know people.
I know someone.
Exactly.
My
and
brother,
so
my coworker, my friend, right?
that's right. And
everyone's got gay folks in their lives, but not everyone has Black folks in their lives.
That's right. That's the really interesting thing, is that you look in most, it's the ridiculously high, the percentage of white people who don't know a Black person or a brown person.
Let's go to questions.
Yes.
Maria Ross is asking us, where does empathy from allies go wrong? Meaning their intention is good and they want to do more, but they make big mistakes. And now they're scared to do more for fearing of screwing up even more. I hear this excuse for inaction from other allies. Can you speak to this?
This is because they haven't done the work, the internal work. These are people who have mean well, but they haven't taken the time to understand the broader context and their own internal issues, right? And so I really think that because I know people personally who I love dearly, but haven't done the internal work in terms of understanding where their own biases come from. And so once we do that, then that it's that willingness to listen. Instead of taking an action, ask the person if they want you to take that action, right? And so it's that combination of doing the internal work and making sure you are in conversation, that you're working in that space before you start to take action.
Awesome. Okay, let's go here to Lindsay Wolf's question. Do you have any advice for how to communicate in workspaces that we need diversity training? I work at a tech firm in Silicon Valley. We are very diverse. I see racism every day, even on our Teams meetings. We're not back in the office. How can I bring it up to HR in a way that will be effective? Or is it more just about me getting better at calling it out individually? Any direction here would be helpful.
Well, this is why I do workshops. Part of the issue, and actually, I have a lot of issues with these one-day workshops where people go in and learn about unconscious bias, because it's not really doing the work that needs to be done. So that's why I've developed, based on the book, and actually part of the reason we developed the reading guide is to say, sometimes you need somebody to come in from the outside and talk about these issues. I actually have been doing that most of my career, but I didn't develop this framework until more recently, because frankly, I was frustrated with my own situation where I would go every year to these meetings, annual political science associate, and talk about how to hire Black faculty, and then nothing happened. And I realized I have to start with making sure people understand that they are part of the problem, and even though they may mean well, they aren't doing the work to create an inclusive space that would make somebody want to be their colleague. Do you even know that the first place to start? What's the story of your organization or your institution? How would you describe it to somebody? Why would somebody like me want to be there? And that's a good place to start.
Yeah, it reminds me back in the day in the 80s when you and I were in the same dorm at Stanford, diversity training was about recognizing that different people exist.
Mm-hmm.
And, we've come so far. Now we're at inclusion, which is, my understanding is, are we certain that everybody here feels they can be their full and complete
That's
self
right.
at all times and be respected and valued? And it necessitates organizations, institutions, workplaces asking, gee, why haven't we cared to have a Black member until George Floyd was murdered? When
Mm-hmm.
one of our local civic organizations called me up and wanted me to be a board member, all of a sudden, it was all I could do not to be enraged back at them. Like, I have been a member of this community for 20 years. You care about me now? Why would I want to join you? You've decided you finally need some Black people. What's in it for me? You know?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I don't want to just join your exclusively white organization and you think you're now diverse and inclusive. You're not. You need to figure out why you've never cared until today. Do that hard work, write a report, talk to me about it, then maybe I'll join.
Mm-hmm.
But
Right.
until that happens, it's not a safe space for me. It's not a space that's going to be enriching for me.
That's right,
Right?
exactly. And and it's interesting because I think we both end up been in positions where we go into these, we are the first Black person in a lot of these spaces, or the first Black woman, whatever it may be. And we have to lay that groundwork, and say, look, that's why it's always, whenever we go into these situations, it's always extra work for us.
Yeah. Let's go to Sylvia Gonzalez Gorman with a question particularly embedded in academe. She
Mhm.
says, I'm a Latina faculty member in a predominantly Latino university. When interacting with other members of my university community, the assumption is that I'm a clerical worker or non-faculty individual, and I get treated a certain way. This is interesting because she says it's a predominantly Latino university, and yet she's treated this way. However, when I do mention that I'm a professor so-and-so, the conversation changes and I get special attention. In communities of color, it seems that a social hierarchy is prevalent. So it's a predominantly Latino university, which I presume means the students are, and yet folks are not realizing that she, a Latina faculty member, is a faculty member. So she's drawing attention to the hierarchies within communities of color. A social hierarchy is present. How do we change this so that we treat each other equally and the same?
And that's where radical empathy comes in, right? I mean, this is why, it's interesting because, unfortunately we need training, right? We all need a way to figure out how to do this, and sometimes it takes somebody coming in from the outside and saying that, hey, you need to basically don't make assumptions about people. The first step is, um why would you assume somebody is anything? I've learned to be very open, and just I try not to make assumptions. I try to, and just treat people equally. Why would I treat the help any better or worse than I would a
Right.
professor?
Right.
I've been the help.
That's great.
And and
Yeah,
I know what
yeah,
that's like.
right.
So
Which is why
go ahead.
those photos of Barack Obama when he was president, when he was, bending his head, little black boy says,
Yes,
"Is
that's
your
my
hair like mine?"
favorite.
Bows down and lets this little black boy touch his hair and see, oh my goodness, the president of the United States has an afro like me. He is somebody that was not above bending down to meet children, nor was he above interacting with the various humans who make the White House run, whether they're
That's right.
janitors or mechanics or cooks or what have you. Some of us walk through this world valuing all humans
Mhm.
as humans. It's like, what's your character? How do you treat people? It's not about the job you have or the title or the salary or your skin color. It's about, are you a good and kind human? If so, like, let's go.
And
Uh,
think about how much more we value, my God, the garbage men who are out there dealing with stuff, that we wouldn't want to have to deal with, especially during COVID. We're really realizing now who are our front line people. It's the construction workers, the plumb. I mean, Texas. I have so many friends in Austin, Texas, and I know some of them are here. My just hearts went out to them. But the plumbers have
yeah,
become some of the most important people and
absolutely.
and firefighters here in California. I mean, we have to get away from this hierarchical understanding of work and what people do. And
Yeah, of-
it's just
yeah.
it can be really hard.
Let me ask if you've got advice about children. You may not, you may. Marcy Fay is asking, do you have any resources or personal thoughts on talking to children about
Mhm.
radical empathy or bridging racial divides?
Yeah, I guess I should be like Ibram Kendi and do a
A
children's
children's
book
book.
next. Yes. But yeah, I've worked with, obviously I have my own children, but I often work with youth, more high schoolers than anything else. But I think we need to, so when it comes to especially younger children, it's all about modeling. And actually, even for adults, that's why I wrote the book. I'm trying to model the behavior for people. And so really, when you even if one of the things we're so afraid of is making mistakes in front of our kids. So but I see those as learning opportunities. So when I make a mistake, I admit it to my boys and I say, look, this is what I learned from this whole you this mistake I made, right? They may not know I made a mistake, but
Yeah,
I will go back and say, look, it wasn't right for me to say this or do that. But, I'm going to learn from it and understand it. Or if I do something right, because sometimes you have to explain to kids, and and sometimes we miss the ball or miss the boat. I mean, I remember talking to my son more recently. I hadn't realized some of the stuff he was dealing with in high school, in terms of his friends being, not saying things that were racist or whatever, and jokingly. And I experienced that in high school, and I should have known that was something he was probably going to experience. And so the other side of it is, just assume that they're experiencing racism, first of all, if you have a child of color. And if even if you don't have a child of color, assume, if you have a child of any background, assume that they are seeing and experiencing some bias and racism, because it's happening in the schools. It happened in my son's school. It's happening everywhere. And so don't hide from it.
right.
Talk to them about it,
Yeah,
when they see, so that when they see it, they know what it is, and they
right.
can talk to you about it. They can, you can model the behavior for them and so on.
When do you think a kid who's not of color is old enough to be taught, like, you have skin color privilege and you should, be prepared to use it if you're out in the world and your friends of color are being mistreated?
I think once they start school,
Five?
because that's, sure. I mean,
Wow.
it's funny because there are books out there so it's really interesting. This is becoming an industry. I'm seeing all these books that are there, and they do. I mean, I asked at that age,
Yeah.
um, what, why people were, and the other thing is, you got to remember, kids are big consumers, even if they're 5, of what's going on in television and, news. They may hear things inadvertently sometimes, but you can't protect your kids from all these things. So I really do believe age 5 is the time to, not necessarily to get into the idea of privilege, but to get, at least explain to them that they have to be in, and I haven't said my favorite word yet, is intentional.
Yes.
You have to be intentional about how you treat people, because sometimes we have ideas about them
Mhm.
that aren't true.
Yeah. Somebody's asked me to clarify. Maria Ross asked if I could clarify what I said about the board inviting me to join, and what would that board need to do to make them come back to you and make you want to get involved? Don't they need input from
Mhm.
Black voices before they can decide? Yeah, here's the subtlety. Don't invite me to be on your board and act like you just discovered me. Tell me, call me up and say, hey, Julie, we're forming a task force to unearth our history and to really examine why we are the way we are. and how we are so deeply not inclusive. We have a goal of being more inclusive, but we know we need to do the work first before our organization is even inviting and welcoming to people who have historically not been here. We need to do the work. So just want to let you know that that's happening, Julie. Would love to send you a draft of that report, get your thoughts. If that had happened, I'd be delighted to know they're doing the work. I'd probably be delighted to read their draft, give my thoughts and feedback. At that point, they've engaged me enough to warrant inviting me to be on their board. That's the difference. Let me work now through some more questions, Terri. This is an anonymous question. How can policy work and radical empathy interact effectively? I am thinking of policies that may have addressed socioeconomic disparities while seemingly leaving the social attitudes unaddressed. Busing being an example. There seem to still be white people in a state of outrage over buying houses in affluent, quote, white areas whose schools are then more diverse. I wonder if more budget allocation for awareness raising of why policy change exists might be useful, and maybe storytelling could be a part of that.
Yeah, I think storytelling is incredibly powerful. That's why I use it. And most of the people I know who do this work use storytelling, you included. And I think that we do need people. Basically, the reason storytelling is powerful is it does help create empathy, right? And so, we need to make sure that we are understanding that, people have to, in schools and so on, when we implement policies, it's like you're saying, even with the board, you need to lay the groundwork. You need to help people understand why it's happening, and not just, I think that the reason some of the busing didn't do very well is because it was kind of imposed, and even for the people who were being bused into the schools, they felt uncomfortable, and it wasn't inclusive, and so on.
Yeah.
So in any case, it's really important that we lay the groundwork, try to help people, and you can't get and this is a good point to get in at the end, is that we're not, this is not a 100% solution, right? There's so many other things we have to do. This is one piece of the puzzle, and obviously policy is a piece of the puzzle, but having, doing the underlying work so that people know why the policy is happening. And yes, there's a great My Grandmother's Hands is a really great book. And so I think that there is an important, that's why I did this book, right? There is an important place for the connection of policy to storytelling and radical empathy.
There's something else that sits at the intersection. This is Stephen McIntosh's question, sits at that intersection of policy and more sort of feelings and storytelling. And those are racial affinity groups. Many schools, high schools, colleges, grad school environments, workplace environments offer affinity groups for people around race or around other identities that may be marginalized or mistreated. And
That's
Stephen
right.
asked, are they helpful in developing radical empathy, or are they harmful?
No, I think they're very helpful. I mean, one of the things we're talking about is inclusion, right? And so, I always, when I talk about hiring, I always say, don't hire one, if you hire one, then that person feels isolated and they don't have anybody to talk to. This happens all the time. I'll start talking to somebody, especially in higher ed, and another Black woman, and they're just so thrilled, to be able to talk to another Black woman. But when I look at my experience at UT Austin, for example, we had a Center for African American Studies. So that was a home for people to go to, but it didn't mean they weren't part of their department or it's just sometimes we need those spaces to talk to other people who have similar experiences. And that goes along all different kinds of identities, right? Being a woman, being Black, being whatever, and LGBTQ and so on. And I think it's important to have those support groups. So yes, I do think they're positive. They can be powerful. They can also help us understand our own stories. And sometimes the work needs to be done within those groups, and then to work outwards towards the other people in an organization.
We have time for one last question, I think. So I'm going to group Suzanne Wertheim's question and Laarni Ayuma's question. They both relate to the emotional weight of this work. Suzanne calls it the emotional labor required when we're trying to help other people learn and develop empathy. She sees the burden as landing on the people who themselves are the dealing with the bias, right? So the sort of the Black and brown people's burden of teaching folks. La Arnie talks about what trainings are available out there for transformative healing that do not center white comfort and fragility. So they're two different things, but we're basically talking about the burden those of us may feel who are perceived to be the ones who need to do the teaching. Like, how can we not land the burden on us? And how can we work on transformative healing without centering white comfort?
Mm-hmm. And well, we do workshops ourselves with around radical empathy, but it's hard to answer that in a short way. But basically, you have to really look at, so yes, I am doing emotional labor, even writing this book and so on. But I look at our generation as the ones who are taking the lead and are doing a lot of this work and are out there. And so, I see it as, I'm going to do this regardless, it's emotional labor, but yes, I'm going to do it. But, look for people who aren't just doing a one-off in terms of doing workshops. It's work that takes more than just a 1 day or a half day workshop. And I have respect for the people who do those things, but, it has to be an ongoing. So, even if it's a train the trainer kind of thing, so I'll leave it there because I know we're past time, but check us out. And thank you so much, Julie. This has been
absolutely
really fun.
Everybody, let's give a round of applause in the chat to Terri Givens, who's the author of so many books, but most importantly, this book, Radical Empathy, out today from Bristol University Press. The link to buy the book is in the chat. It will be put in the chat as soon as we stop applauding Terri. We'll put the link back. Remember, there is a code for 50% off. My goodness, you need to buy a lot of these books. We're already seeing the chat. It's already sold out on Amazon. Buy it at Bristol University Press's link, and 50% off Radical Empathy. Terri, you've done a terrific job with this book. I'm trying to write inclusive books. I'm a nonfiction writer too. Someone asked me to mention my new book. It's called Your Turn, How to Be an Adult. It's coming out in April. The focus here today is not me, but to the person who asked. And that book is deeply inclusive of all humans. As I've written a book about how to be an adult, I'm trying to show the stories of all different kinds of adults from all walks of life. Because how we tell our nonfiction narratives can be a part of this transformational, I keep forgetting the term, transitional justice.
Absolutely.
Or our writing can reflect the colonization inherent in British and American publishing. So continue to do the work, Terri. Continue to teach us about radical empathy. Continue to meld your political science expertise with your lived Black woman in America expertise, and continue to be a leader in making our society a better place for all. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. Buy the book. Join Terri at her next event. I think somebody said the next event is.
Well, we have we have an event coming up. For folks who are connected to Foundation for College Education, we're doing one on Sunday, and actually just keep an eye out. The best way to find out what's next is to follow me on social media. And yes, we love FCE. And okay. So we've got a lot of different events coming up in the next few months. And also, if you're interested in having me as a speaker or Julie as a speaker, we are usually available. So,
Terri, what are your social handles? I'm going to pop them in right now.
Oh, so I'm just at Terri Givens on Twitter. And while you do that, and so and on everything else, and once more for the book, if the folks from Bristol can post that again,
please. Carlos is asking. Terrific.
There we go.
Also want to give a special thanks to the folks at Bristol University Press who've helped bring this book to life. Terri, I know you're very grateful to them for publishing you, and I'm grateful to them and to Terri for giving me this opportunity. So we're done, folks. What's the code? Carlos says, what's the code? It's empathy 50. All one word, like this.
There we go.
Okay. 50 is your discount code. Okay, folks, we're officially ending. We're saying goodbye. It's time for you to sign off. We're grateful that you're here. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Buy this book, recommend this book. Terri, I hope you're glancing at the chat and scrolling,
I
seeing
am.
all the love, tremendous love
No,
for
I
you on your
am.
publication day. Thanks, everybody.
Yes.
Time to
Don't forget.
exit.
Yes, don't forget to download the reading guide.
Reading
So,
guide. They've also put that in the chat. Yep. Good. Free reading guide.
happy
Absolutely.
Publication Day. Thank you, everybody. And Julie, you're the best.
Oh, this was fun. This was fun.